I'm sure Trump wanted to believe that God had saved him because Trump is messianic in his own mad way, isn't he? Yeah. He's a bit of an odd, huge orange tank Jesus, but he is basically, people want to make everyone into Jesus. And by the way, I talk about this in the book quite a lot. When I say God, I talk quite a lot about the Abrahamic or other versions of God, but we have thousands of different types of gods in our culture. The book ends with me talking about the death of Elizabeth II and how the deification in death of Elizabeth II, as I watched a 7-mile queue to see her coffin, I thought this is people wanting to believe in magic.
Welcome to Thinkers on Times Radio. Thank you so much for joining us. This is where we take a chance to a bit longer time, a bit more nuance to explore some of the important issues today with some of the great minds. And my guest today is genuinely a great mind, I think, a public intellectual. There's not very many of them about. He's also a hugely funny man, a talented man, a great writer, a comedian, a thinker. It's David Baddiel. Welcome to you.
Hello, Stig. Thank you very much. I mean, you've used the word public intellectual there, and in Britain, I've said this before, if you aspire to that, or call yourself it, or occupy it in any way, you're immediately ridiculed in a way that I think is probably correct and good in terms of our Britishness, but also I know that if I was sort of French, I mean, that's the obvious one, but even sort of German or Dutch or even American, you could sort of be called that and people would be fine with it. But in Britain, sort of no one is really happy with it. I wonder if, John Locke was like, I don't really want to call myself a public intellectual.
Don't set yourself up too hard.
Exactly, yeah.
But you are, and you write these beautiful books. Obviously, you wrote a great book called Jews Don't Count. Among many others, written beautiful novels as well. But this is what we want to talk about today, The God Desire. It's a short book. It's a book about atheism. It's a book about faith. So let's talk about it.
Before we do, I'm going to have to say something which possibly you have referred to, but I'm going to have to say that Stig is responsible for these books, which I think we should say that. I want to say it. I want to say it because so Stig, when he was editing the Times Literary Supplement, you basically came to me and said, okay, we want to do these kind of short essay books, sort of in the style of George Orwell when he wrote books about politics and the English language or whatever, these kind of short, polemic, whatever. What do you want to write about? And I sort of instantly said, I want to write about the way that Jews and anti-Semitism are sort of not on the table of, this present conversation about race and blah, blah, blah. And I think I just had that idea there and then, and that led to Jews Don't Count. And so, you are the godfather of these books.
And the point about these books is you take an idea, sometimes an idea that's a bit uncomfortable to some people, and you give it not 100,000 words, but 20,000 words.
Yeah.
And a chance to think about it properly. And we talk a lot about faith and faithlessness and atheism. And kind of atheism is almost, to many people at least, particularly in the intellectual sphere, the kind of default unthinking position. God probably doesn't exist, so let's not worry about it. But that's not what you're saying with this book.
No.
Tell us what the point of this is. The point is that you might be an atheist, but faith is incredibly attractive as a notion as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's quite... One of the things about the books being short is I'm trying to drill down as much as possible into the intellectual specifics of whatever it is I'm talking about. And in The God Desire, which is in a way, at some level, it's a more personal book than Jews Don't Count, I'm trying to examine what is it about... the desire that I think exists in all of us for there to be a God, and that's why we have endless legends over millennia of the idea of gods or gods whatever. What is that desire, and how can I, as an atheist, pretend it doesn't exist? Like, that's the thing. This is like it's actually kind of a slightly minute difference, you might say, but a very important difference between this book and The God Delusion. It's very specifically a play on The God Delusion, All God Is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, or all the other new atheist books. And the key element, I would guess, is that those guys, and I'm generalising, but I think I'm correct, are pretty macho about religion. Their basic, and God, their basic approach is, it's all it's all nonsense. It's all a fairy tale. So therefore, I'm just going to trash it. Yeah. And I also absolutely, I would say more so than Richard Dawkins, believe that God does not exist. I kind of know absolutely that God does not exist. But I feel the desire to believe in God like any other human being, because you cannot disacknowledge that there must be a massive, massive desire within human beings to believe in God, because that has been the foundation of our culture and our psychology and all the rest of it. So really, this is a long answer, but I started to think about that, and I thought, okay, I'm going to write a book about how my atheism is predicated on the knowledge that my desire for God is so strong that he can't exist. It's kind of depressive position that leads to atheism.
So why is it not the case that the Enlightenment and the idea of science and explication of the world doesn't just kill that off? Because that's what I think you're talking about in the other atheists. Richard Dawkins is a classic example of this. We don't need God because we can explain everything. And if we can explain everything, actually that desire goes away because there's nothing for that desire to fill.
I think that the word that you use there, which is very important, is need, right? Because essentially that's what this book is about, is the need for God. So from an intellectual point of view, a Richard Dawkins point of view, I guess, you just said we don't need God because we can explain the world without him, right? That doesn't mean you don't need God, because need is a psycho-emotional state.
Yeah.
And what are our primary needs? Our primary needs, psycho-emotionally, are to not feel alone, to feel that the world has meaning for us, to feel that perhaps death is not the end, to feel that our loved ones may in some way be in communication with us even though they've gone. These are needs, and those needs are not met by explanations of how the world works rationally. So we have created and continue to create, even though science might now be more certain that those things are not real than they were, we continue to have the need, right?
Does everyone have that need, though, Dave? Because I was trying to think about that myself when I read the book, and I've thought about this a lot, and we've spoken before about things like this. Does everyone need there to be, I mean, 'cause one of the great discoveries I made was when I first read Origin of the Species, found out evolution, suddenly understood evolution. And that seemed to suggest to me that chance, the thing that's driven the world, is just luck.
Yeah.
And there's a combination of chemicals that creates the world, and there's a combination of genetic changes that are tested by the environment, and then by survival of the fittest, we end up where we are. And so everything is luck. And if everything is luck, nothing needs to carry the weight of more meaning, and that's kind of a massive relief.
No, I don't agree. I mean, you might feel that personally, but I don't think en masse, the mass psychology of humanity feels that in any way.
And you don't feel that.
I'll come back to that, because let's take the position of examining how the world works or how humanity works. Because what this book really is a book of psychology, and it uses, because most of the time what people use to justify their atheism or to give their atheist argument is kind of pure science, if you like, and the science of, say, astronomy or whatever, or physics, and here you are, here's how the world actually started, and there's no evidence, obviously, for a God, so that's the truth of it. But actually, I'm more interested in, because I kind of think that is a settled thing. Yeah. I'm not interested in having that argument. Of course, that argument is correct, and yet people still believe in God. Yeah. So it's more interesting to say my atheism comes from a examination or a deconstruction of what I believe to be the case about human psychology, which is that human psychology will carry on having a need for God in the face of the absolute truth that the world is created by accident and by chance and is just an ongoing state of chaos and has no meaning. As John Updike, a believer, said, we are just here for a moment in this complex interval of light. That is the truth, even though he believed. It's interesting that he believed. Yeah. But we carry on, and in fact, against what I think we thought was going to happen with progress, religion has completely risen again. Maybe it seemed to be vanishing in the 80s and 90s as a force, but when fundamentalism reared its head, and in America, Christian fundamentalism and all the rest of it, and, you know, conflicts in the Middle East, what are they about, right? Yeah. They're about many things, but they're definitely also about religion, right? It's a massive player in world affairs. So the idea of like, well, we don't need it because we proved that the world's, it's not true about human psychology. So for me, my atheism, just to sort of explain it again, because I'm not sure I was entirely clear about it, what I said. My atheism, although I believe in all the science stuff, it's primarily about I can so see it. I can so see it because I do feel it. I can so see how much en masse we do still need a sense that that we have a story, right? Which is not true, by the way. We make up story, but human beings have to storyfy life, and we think all the time that we're part of a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and a moral order, and that we have some significance, and that we have a witness in that story because a story needs an audience, right?
Yeah.
All of that is provided at an level, at an archetypal level by God, by the super parent that is God, right? And it doesn't go away because it's such a basic part of human psychology. And that is why I'm an atheist, because I know that those things exist. And unlike those other atheists, I acknowledge them as real powerful emotional forces within me and within all human beings. And they make me know that we've invented God.
And possibly they're kind of ruined by religion, because religion then becomes the superstructure around which all that is fostered.
Yeah.
But the distinction between God and religion then is religion maybe ruined it for everyone.
Well, that's an interesting thing. The book is not, at some level, isn't about religion.
No.
It's about God and why we believe in God and why that tells me he doesn't exist. That's what the book is really about and why it's called The God Desire. Then you get people will say to me, but what about organised religion and how awful it is? And I kind of think, yeah, but that's not what the book's about. No. Similarly, when people say, well, how would we have any moral order without religion? Religious people don't say that. I say, yeah, maybe we wouldn't, maybe we would. That's not what the book's about. No. It's not, as I say in the book sometimes, it is not the responsibility of truth to worry about the consequences of the truth, by which I mean if one day the whole world woke up and genuinely realised like there is no God and that might lead to terrible anarchy, or it might lead to something else where somehow we find a way of settle human order via, without a God thing. But it doesn't matter in terms of the truth, which is there is no God. So to come back to the religion thing, yes, I guess. Yes, of course, organised religion is responsible for many, many terrible things. Interestingly, I guess one other facet of this book, and one other reason I wrote it, is I am a Jew. And I noticed something about all the atheists as well, which is that they are generally not members of certainly a religious minority or associated with religion minority. People like Dawkins and Hitchens or whatever, they tend to be Christians or Anglicans or whatever. And I think that's something else they don't have, which is they don't really understand the power. And this is really what the book is about, really. I understand the power of religion and of faith, particularly if you're in a persecuted minority. If you come from centuries and centuries of knowing that the only thing that you had in terms of survival of your identity was a belief in this thing that gave, and that's nothing to do again with the supernatural being. That's to do with identity.
Well, exactly, and to a certain extent, that's an interesting point. Because being Jewish isn't necessarily about believing in a God.
No,
it's about history and ethnicity. Oh, I mean, I'm not trying to Jew-splain to you. I'm not.
No. That's very important. I mean, one of the central issues of. Almost the most important thing in Jews Don't Count. I didn't really know this when I wrote it. But if there was a moment in Jews Don't Count that had non-Jews thinking, oh, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. It was the bit, I sort of said it on telly a couple times as well, when I said, no, anti-Semitism is racism. It's not religious intolerance. Yeah. And the reason I can prove this is I'm an atheist, and that would have made no difference to the Nazis, who would have put me straight into Auschwitz. No free passes out of Auschwitz for the many, many Jews who did not believe in God, because the Nazis weren't interested in...
Yet you think the existence of a kind of persecuted minority, the way it thinks about itself, somehow points to a desire for a God, even if their needs might be they might be doing it for non-supernatural reasons.
Well, no, it definitely points to a desire for a God, but it's also something else, which is what I think, as I say, people like Dawkins don't quite realise when they upset people, when they just say, well, I'm just talking about Islam, or I'm just talking about, whatever religion it might be, in the same way that I talk about any religion, is that a persecuted minority feels that their identity is, in a very subtle way, tied up with all these religious beliefs, with all these stories, even if they don't necessarily believe. I mean, there's a bit in the book where I think I talk about going to a funeral of a Jewish child, and the father of the child, who's not a believer, still reading the Kaddish, which is the Jewish prayer for the dead, the Hebrew prayer for the dead. And what I say in the book, which is absolutely true, is I am utterly moved by the sound, the sonics, the pure sense that something in this is connecting me to centuries of survival and defiance and tradition, none of which makes me think that there's someone listening to that in the skies. But it still moves me, and I have to deal with that as an atheist, actually. It's a complex thing to deal with as an atheist. I think, sorry, if I go to measure, there's another bit where I talk about Simon Sharma on telly, talking about the Jews being expelled from Spain, whenever they were expelled by Spain. I'm going to say 1492, but I think that was also when Christopher Columbus. Yeah, so it feels like it can't be right, both those dates. But it was round about then, they were expelled from Spain. And he does this whole thing about how, remember Jews were expelled from Britain, blah, 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 about how would you know that these people were Jewish? Well, you might know them by their food that they ate or by their closed sort of family systems or whatever, but primarily you would know because as the boats left the harbour of southern Spain looking for somewhere to go, you could hear them saying the Shema, which is the Lord's Prayer. And I find that moving, whilst having absolutely no belief that there is a Lord hearing that prayer, because it says something about the survival of that culture.
But does that not mean, though, David, that actually you don't need God in any of this?
No, I don't need God in any of it.
But even as you're being moved by history, you're being moved by community, you're being moved by language, you're being moved by the transmission of language. That doesn't necessarily mean that there's a human desire for God. That just means there's a human desire for family.
No, I think so. I disagree with that. Sorry,
Okay,
I think
very welcome to disagree with
I think
that.
there's an extra spin. That's why I brought up the Jewish element. There's an extra spin on my God desire as a result of being Jewish, and the extra spin is because I come from a minority with centuries and centuries of persecution, and thus holding on to those things which mark you as from that minority has been hard won and carved out of the fire of terrible things that have happened, you prize it, right? And it's impossible to completely separate that from the prayers, essentially, because the prayers are part of it. And I know this. Passover is now. Yeah. I do Passover. I will be at my family's Seder with my half Jewish, half Catholic children and their completely non-Jewish girlfriends and boyfriends and whatever. And it's important to me, in a very sort of difficult, in a way, to psychologically break down, to continue those traditions, even though I absolutely, at the same level, there's an irony. I'm ironic about it, all the things that Jews are about doing these things. Anyway, put that to one side. That's my extra spin. Yeah. But at heart, I'm talking about what I feel is all humanity. And all humanity, I do think, has a desire for God. Essentially, it comes down to death. There's lots and lots and lots and lots of other reasons to do with meaning and, as I said, narrativization of the self and whatever. But the primary thing is we die. We're the only animals who know that we die. And once we know that we die, we are frightened. And we want to find a way around that. Okay, like animals are quite important in the book. Right, I talk about why we're allowed to eat animals. We clearly think that we can eat animals because they are, at some level, a lesser form.
Yeah, they don't have souls.
They don't have souls. They're not made in God's image, like apparently we are. That's why we're allowed to eat animals. Because otherwise you think, like, what are we doing? Eating these creatures that we, incredibly cruel to.
And why can't we don't eat dogs because they have more souls?
They have more souls, No, I mean, it's a ridiculous idea that we just think it's fine to eat animals. But also, animals, because they don't have any awareness of death, have no God. It's not just because they don't have language, because they kind of do have language. They kind of do have culture, but none of them have ever come up with the idea of a God.
So afterlife is kind of important in all of this, do you think?
No, it's massively important. It's not just an afterlife as in the straightforward idea. I mean, that is important. And sometimes people will say to me, I think Stephen Fry said to me, who wrote a lovely thing for this book, but because he loves sleeping, he said to me, Stephen Fry, he said, I like the idea of death. I mean, at some level, I like the idea of just death. And I think, no, but that's confusing something. Like, I begin the book by talking about how when I was 6 or 7, I first understood death. Right? That was the first time I understood everyone will die, I will die, or your parents will die, your cat will die. And it caused me enormous anxiety, and I spoke to my mum about it, and she said, don't worry, death is like a long sleep from which you never wake up. And soon after that, I became a lifelong insomniac. Right? And clearly, I'm sort of frightened of sleep, because it is but what is sleep? Like, I was doing a conversation about this book with a theologian, a really brilliant theologian, and he brought that up. He said he likes sleep, and he said, I like, particularly if I sometimes have an anaesthetic, I sort of love the idea that I'm going to be put to sleep. Nothingness. It's great. And I said, when do you have that love? When do you think about that love? And he looked a bit confused. I said, when you wake up. Yeah. Right. So there's no sense that you can really imagine nothingness from a point of view of never coming back from it. Like when people imagine nothingness and say, I quite like the idea, I think they're imagining it as something they do for a bit.
Because what we're talking about here is infinite time. The idea that you're on this earth for a short period of time, and then when it's over, there is nothingness, and maybe that feels like a relief and a release. But it's almost impossible for your brain to conceptualize being gone forever.
Yes, it is.
Because in order to have any form of definition, you have to have an endpoint to then work back from.
Yeah.
And the story that religion gives to, and God gives to a certain extent, is maybe there's a point after all of this which retrospectively makes it all make sense, rather than just simply not existing in perpetuity.
Absolutely. And I also think that, some people will go on about like that thing, like, I say, I don't want to exist forever. And I don't, in the front of my mind, want to exist forever either. But these are deep unconscious psychologies, and not wanting to exist forever in a kind of rational way doesn't mean I'm not frightened of death, right? And also, which is a sort of simpler thing, when people say, because there's a sense in which that being very frightened of your own death feels a bit selfish, a bit shallow, and and I remember John Updike saying rather brilliantly about, because he was always very frightened of death despite being a Christian or whatever, he said, no, it's not shallow and selfish, because it's not really about me, it's about having to leave the party. It's about having to leave the greater world. It's a social anxiety. It's like never seeing anyone else again. And if you really come back to me as a kid, I think the thing that I was frightened of was actually not my own death, it was my parents' death, right? And sort of my friend's death. At some level, it was like, oh, I'm never going to see my best friend, who, by the way, was called Saul Jacob Rosenberg. He's like Jewish. I don't know if that makes that clear.
Feels that way.
But I remember, but it's that. It's like, what do we pine for? We pine for, even if we're, incredibly don't believe in God and are like okay with the idea of our own death, we'd still quite like to see our loved ones who have gone again, would we not?
Even though rationally we know it's been possible. How do you have an afterlife when what part of your life gets brought back? What part of your, and the view that's you, how does a soul have a form? All of that stuff is impossible and intellectually impossible to think about. But you feel there's something beyond rationality,
completely beyond rationality,
that pulls us.
And it's interesting to see in great atheists the way that is rejected emotionally. So there's a bit where I quote Bertrand Russell, possibly the greatest British atheist philosopher, in which he says something like, when I die, I think this is a correct quote actually, when I die, my body and my ego shall rot. And then he says, but I scorn those who would shiver at the thought of oblivion. And the word I'm interested in there is scorn. Because why do you need to feel, in a slightly macho adolescent way, Bertrand, somehow better than people who are frightened of this very frightening thing?
And I do this,
right? Why not be frightened?
Be frightened. I always say that I don't want a funeral. Throw me in a bin.
Yeah.
And that's a very macho thing. I don't care.
It is quite macho.
Throw me in a bin. It doesn't matter. None of this matters. Once I'm dead, I'm dead. It's gone. I'm meat. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, here's the thing about, firstly, I would say if I was your therapist, that is you being frightened of death. And try to cover it by being very dismissive about all that. At the same time, I agree. Like, there is no point in a funeral, certainly for me. I mean, there is a point in terms of people who are left behind, and I think it makes sense of something that feels like it can't be. But for me, obviously, no. I'm going to make no. And people who say what they would have wanted, this is what they would have wanted. I used to do a joke about that years ago. I would say, I can't remember what it was now, but it was something about my grandfather and what he would have wanted. And I said, well, what my grandfather would have wanted if he was still alive was to be dug up, right? But the thing, I agree that there is no point in all that, and to some extent you might as well throw me in a garbage can as well. But here's the thing for me, which makes me different from you, or maybe it doesn't, I don't know, but I don't think that helps with my fear of death. I acknowledge absolutely straightforwardly, and will continue to acknowledge, no, I'm frightened of death. And I think our culture is desperate for people not to be. Like, if you read a long interview with somebody who's quite old, they'll practically always end with saying they've come to terms with it. And there are films where, that's looming, people always come to terms with it or whatever. And I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that because I'm definitely frightened of it. And it comes from something quite positive in a strange way, which is I really like life. Life is f***ing great. It's so great. Even when it's, Ira Gershwin said of sex that when it's good, it's really good, and when it's bad, it's still pretty good. And that is true of life. Life is, it's really got to be very bad for it not to be better than the alternative. Right? And so that's why I'm frightened of death.
Are you surprised that Donald Trump has used God? You talked about the revival of religiousness, which I think is really interesting, and it's unquestionably the case that it felt that sort of secular intellectualism, post-Enlightenment secular thought was going to kill religion, and it hasn't done measurably. Place like Africa, booming. America, it's booming. Certain parts of Orthodox Christianity in this country.
And Russia.
And all over the place. But I was still surprised, and maybe you weren't surprised, that when Donald Trump, the assassin's bullet touches his ear, it is amazing how quickly now he wants to appeal to the evangelical Christians, and that's a very important political bloc. But even beyond that, it struck me as incredible how in 2024, his protection, God stepping down and moving the bullet, was a real thing. And it was a thing that a lot of his supporters said, you still see it. It's still even now, a year later, a thing. Are you surprised? I mean, does that speak
Not
to
really. I mean, Ben Shapiro, a big Trump right-wing supporter, very, very clever bloke, said the thing about, facts don't care about your feelings. He's an Orthodox Jew, right? Now, I respect that, obviously, as a Jew. I also think none of those things are facts, Ben. That whole Orthodox Jew, that whole religion thing, none of it is facts. It's all just made up, right? And so what what everyone knows is that you can harness those stories to your advantage. But I think also not even tactically. I'm sure Trump wanted to believe that God had saved him because Trump is messianic in his own mad way, isn't he? Yeah. He's a bit of an odd, huge orange tank Jesus, but he is basically, people want to make everyone into Jesus. And by the way, I talk about this in the book quite a lot. When I say God, I talk quite a lot about the Abrahamic or other versions of God, but we have thousands of different types of gods in our culture. The book ends with me talking about the death of Elizabeth II and how the deification in death of Elizabeth II, as I watched a 7-mile queue to see her coffin, I thought this is people wanting to believe in magic. Yeah. I mean, essentially, that is what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about in the God Desire is people wanting to believe in God, but really what they want to believe in is magic. They want to believe that the world has something else beyond the material and something else beyond death. And what is... I love this, that Lucy Prebble, who's a writer on Succession, I use it. When she saw that, she said, well, in a way, we're all in a 7-mile queue for a coffin, right? Which is absolutely brilliant, because that 7-mile queue for a coffin is trying to disprove that fact. Yeah. It's trying to say, no, when I get there, I will feel something. I will feel something else. I will feel in touch with something beyond death.
And probably to a certain extent, Trump plays into that. The cult of Trump speaks these same things. That there's the magic of his merciful release from death there. But generally speaking, people talk about the cult of Trump, and that's because they think that people believe there's something greater there. Yeah. And he's messianic. You use the word. There's a proud history. Messianic. What did I say?
So messianic.
Messianic. Messianic. Oh, I'll say probably. There's a proud tradition of messiahs, false messiahs, which are gathering together something. And what you're talking about, that Trump is gathering together the God Desire. Yeah,
entirely. I mean, this is not an original thought, but it's obviously the case that politically we invest certain, mainly men, with godlike qualities when they become the people who we follow, right? Remember, we follow these people. In a sense, we worship them, and it's not hard to see. Again, I'm talking about mass human psychology here. So a very, very straightforward example is North Korea. So North Korea has no religion in terms of like traditional religion, but it has completely created a religion around the Kims, right? Like literally that they believe that they believe in legends. That I can't remember what the first one is called, but whatever the first Kim, they now believe in that he was sort of born on a mountain, right, and passed on his power, his magic to his son, and then to his son, and whatever. And the buying into that is utterly about the human need to worship and to deify.
Roman emperors, the same thing. They became gods after they died.
Yeah, I remember actually when I showed my son some footage of the crowds at the death of Diana, and I remember him saying, "Oh, it's a bit like when North Korean presidents die." Yeah. And I thought, that's a good analogy. It's just the same thing. It's where people need to feel something greater than themselves, and we seem to often focus on an individual who we can make into a god, and then they do magic stuff that we celebrate in a mad way, and then when they die, we are shredding our garments and like wailing in the streets.
Or there's people like you and me, I would suppose. You'd still be stroking your chin saying, this is candle in the wind, it's ridiculous, it's maudlin. This is a maudlin collection of people who are abandoning all rationality for a woman they would probably not care about actually, if saying about Princess Diana, or in Trump, a guy who manifestly, measurably does not care about them at all.
Yes, that's true.
And yet we are saying, or people are saying, but there will always be people at the sideline stroking their beards saying, this is all mad.
Well, although I actually wrote a whole novel in which there was one character who realised it was all mad and another character who completely bought into it, because I try and think in terms of, no, I understand where this might come from. Trump, there's one other thing as well, which is very important, which is that if you look at the way that we create identity now, particularly online, but we've always done it, but you can see it very strongly online, is we do it in opposition. The reason there's so much rage on social media, which I think no one completely predicted, is that social media is not a marketplace of ideas, it's a marketplace of identity. It's people saying, I am this, I am an anti-vaxxer.
I'm not this.
Right, and the way you do this, or I'm a trans activist, or whatever else it might be, and the way that you publicly really hammer that home, yes, is by saying that, and now that I must hate these people, these other people who are not me. That's how you do that. Now, where does that come from? It comes from Catholic and Protestant. It comes from Sunni and Shia. It also, by the way, comes from Chelsea and Tottenham, or whatever else it might be. The way you feel more yourself, which is what human beings are so desperate to feel all the time, I am this, right, is by shouting down and being angry about the other people. Trump is an unbelievable example of that. The religion of Trumpism is almost totally based on, we hate the liberals, we hate the Democrats, we hate the woke, right? Now, it's not to say that it doesn't come back from that side in shades, but Trump has kind of monetized that brilliantly, that idea that the way you create a religion, a cult, is by hatred of the people who are not you.
We can carry on talking this forever, but we have to stop at some point. Before we go, we were on a podcast together once, David. You won't remember this. You told me what I think is one of the most perfect jokes ever. Was it the Holocaust one?
Yeah, I tell you, I just saw this yesterday. Something that me off about this joke.
Do you not like it? Is it?
No, I love the joke, but I'm now going to publicly say something, which is that Ricky Gervais, who's a friend of mine, came to see me talking, I think he must have come and seen it because I did it in Trolls, Not the Dolls. And then he was in Comedians in Cars with Coffee, and him and Jerry Seinfeld.
I saw this. He nicked it.
Well, to be fair to Ricky, he did nick it. Well, he did nick it because. But I'm saying he didn't nick it because it wasn't my joke. Fine. I say in the show, which I do, that the joke was told to me by a Jewish academic, a wonderful woman called Devorah Baum. She told me the joke, but Ricky saw it there and doesn't credit me with it. No. I mean, let's be straightforward about this.
And then he soaks up Jerry Seinfeld.
Jerry loves it. Yeah. And I think Jerry even says, where did you hear that? And Ricky's like, I can't remember. So I'm just going to make that point. Yeah. But the joke is a great joke.
Tell the joke, and then we'll finish on the...
It's partly because I actually use the joke to talk about something else, which is like people say you can't make jokes about this, you can't make jokes about that. I think you can make jokes about anything. It depends on the joke, not the subject matter. And to illustrate that, this is a joke about the Holocaust, which we can't make jokes about that. Yes, you can. So after the war, a Holocaust survivor dies after the war from natural causes, and he goes to heaven. And when he gets to heaven, God says to the Holocaust survivor, tell me a Holocaust joke. So the survivor does. He tells God a Holocaust joke, and God says, that's not funny. And the survivor says, well, I guess you had to be there. And it's such a beautiful joke because not only is it just a funny thing to say, it also says something very profound about, like, if you believe in God, which I think I made clear that I don't, but if you did, you might chart his absence from the world because of what happened in 1939 to 45. And where was God then? I mean, actually, I know you want to finish, don't you? No, I'm just going to say something, which is one thing I definitely don't ascribe to is the atheists who say, well, if there's a God, why the Holocaust? Why cancer? Why? I'm not interested in that at all, because I kind of think, well, you might think, well, God wants there to be evil and terrible stuff in the world. Free will, and also so that there's goodness. You can't have goodness without terribleness, so that might be part of God's plan. So that's not an argument for me, but I still think it's a very beautiful joke.
It is a magnificent joke. I think we've gone all over the shop, David. It's such a pleasure speaking to you. It's such a good book. I know it's such a great thing to read because it's not long.
No, that's true.
We live in a time where there's no attention span. We've been talking for longer than most shows about this type of thing. But the book is it's such a brilliant, thoughtful thing. And
Thank you.
You're a great man. And I think we should talk about this sort of stuff more without being angry. There's no anger about this.
There's no anger.
And what you're saying is, I'm guilty of sneering at the religious, because I attribute madness to it and I see all the folly that's come on the back of it. But you're so right to caution against that, because there must be something there. And if you don't respect that, then maybe you're not being intellectually honest either.
Yeah, respect, stroke, empathise is what I think. Is like to pretend that you have no empathy with people who want to believe in God, I think is a lie.
Yeah. And that's a lovely thought to leave on. David, thank you so much for joining us. That's David Baddiel there. Thank you so much for watching this. Do subscribe and like. If you want to leave comments below the line, you can do that. I'm sure it'll be a thoughtful and respectful thing, not just a big, old, angry rant. This is Thinkers on Times Radio. We'll be back for some more next week. Thank you so much for joining us.